Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Amidst the cacophony of Russia, collusion, Venezuela, a wall, and healthcare, we don't always appropriately triage our greatest national security threat, the very real and existential threat of climate change. That's why some feel it's important to go to extremes to call attention to the issue and the dangers. This past weekend in New York witnessed the first national day of action for a new group called Extinction Rebellion, a grassroots social movement that began in the UK last fall and has now come to America. One of its organizers is our guest today on the Who, What, Why podcast. He is Rory Varrato. He's a student in the Philosophy and Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University, and currently serves on the Media and Messaging Working Group for the New York City chapter of Extinction Rebellion. It is my pleasure to welcome Rory Varrato here. Rory, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you a lot for having me.
Tell us about Extinction Rebellion. How did it get started originally in the UK last fall, and a little bit about its history and some of the organizers?
Sure. As you alluded to, the origins of the movement are in the UK, and a little bit of that is shrouded in mystery even to those of us who are involved in the organization. But I can tell you that in late October, there were open letters issued that were signed by many prominent academics, including Noam Chomsky, Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, and some politicians as well. And they framed climate breakdown in very, I would say, dire but realistic terms, and advocated for the kinds of direct actions that Extinction Rebellion would then go on to take. So shortly afterward, November 17th, I believe, Extinction Rebellion took major action in London, shutting down 5 bridges over the Thames. And this got international attention and was sort of like a signal flare going up for other like-minded folks around the world. So that action, that initial action, inspired the opening of chapters of Extinction Rebellion globally in small towns and large cities alike. And here in New York City, we've been only in existence since early December. And in that time, we've grown rapidly and managed to plan this major action that we conducted in Midtown this past Saturday.
Talk a little bit about the goal of these direct actions. What do you hope to accomplish by these events? The event in London being, of course, the most notorious, but similar events that are taking place around the world.
Sure. I think there are multiple goals, and one of them, probably the most significant, is to communicate. Civil disobedience is an act of political communication, and so Extinction Rebellion engages in direct action, nonviolent direct action, and disruption for the purpose of communicating a message, and that message is precisely that climate breakdown is much more dangerous and threatening than is recognized in most of the mainstream media. And of course, there are many climate change deniers like the president himself, and that's a whole different sort of problem. But the direct actions are intended to bring attention to this fact and to sort of shake people out of their apathy and their sleep about this matter, because really our only hope is through coordinated collective action. The governments, I should say, around the world are not only not doing enough, as we saw with, for example, Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the Paris Accords, which themselves were inadequate to address the problems, but they are actively exacerbating climate breakdown through allowing the expansion of activities like fracking. And now another example might be with the ascendancy of Bolsonaro in Brazil. The Amazon is under immediate threat. So Extinction Rebellion takes the view that it is genuinely up to the people, broadly construed, to form a grassroots democratic movement that can basically work to sustain life, including human life on Earth, given the crazy circumstances that are already here and on the way.
Given the nature of direct action, how do you see that, and how does the organization see it as a way to translate that into political action. Certainly, it calls attention to the issue, and arguably it calls attention among those people that are already believers in the cause. How does it translate into political action, particularly among those that might be on the fence or don't realize the urgency of the problem?
Great question. I think one way that it can translate is through the form of applying pressure, and also sort of just making politicians aware of the fact that not only is there a demand for these kinds of changes, but the demand is a strong demand. It's a demand that has really the threat of action behind it. And so, for example, following the shutdown of the bridges in London, shortly afterward, the mayor of London declared a climate emergency in that city. And those are the kinds of responses that we're hoping to get from people as a result of our actions. And I think, there's never sort of a clear or straight line between civil disobedience and public policy change. I think it's necessarily messy because civil disobedience by its nature takes place outside of the accepted and conventional channels for political action. But by raising awareness and by generating a clear demand or clear demands, politicians eventually feel that pressure and respond accordingly.
Given all the other noise and chatter that exists in the political landscape today, talk about how much harder it is to call attention to something like climate change.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Not only is there an enormous amount of chatter, as you say, but there's also active dis and misinformation campaigns and propaganda around climate change, climate breakdown. So we're up against, for example, ExxonMobil and other stakeholders in the fossil fuel industry that have real incentives for minimizing and neutralizing any anti-fossil fuel message. So that's part of the reason, in fact, why civil disobedience is the centerpiece of Extinction Rebellion's movement, is because here is some form of activity that can cut through that noise and those misinformation campaigns and receive some attention. But it's still challenging then to sort of build a bridge of communication between a drastic and disruptive act of public civil disobedience, which many people will be inclined by their own biases to ignore or dismiss. It's difficult to build that bridge between those actions and between a more, elaborate and detailed plan of action. But I think to its credit, and part of what attracted me to the movement, is that Extinction Rebellion articulates its demands up front. So it's rooted in demands, in other words. And we're still developing and working on those and expanding those. But in contrast to, say, the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, which struggled to articulate its demands at times, although great things came out of Occupy, like the language of the 1% and the 99%, et cetera. Extinction Rebellion sort of from the get-go says, here are our demands, here's what we're about, and we're performing these actions in this way to produce these results.
Is there a danger that civil disobedience, particularly around this issue and because of the nature of the debate on the issue, will work against bringing in some of the people that most need to be made aware of and politically engaged in something like this?
Yes, I think that is a possibility, and so we have to engage or employ a diversity of tactics, but we also have to be firmly committed to our core and central message and purpose. And so, yes, we will deter or dissuade some people, probably through some of our actions. But if we're operating in good faith and we believe in what we're doing, we do it nonviolently, peacefully, etc., the hope is that we can disarm some people who may be inclined to ignore us or to even get angry at us. and get them to just listen. This, in large part, the Extinction Rebellion is about getting folks to pause and listen and question their beliefs, and also to interrogate what exactly it is that Extinction Rebellion is doing and why. And sort of speaking for myself, I would say that given the urgency, given the fact that we need to act immediately, there's a sense in which we shouldn't worry too much about not reaching, say, climate change deniers. We need to reach, at least at first, folks who are most receptive to our message and build outward from there. Because I think the key is not convincing people that climate change is real. Many people do believe that, even though there are large numbers of deniers in the United States, for example, but rather shifting sort of the narrative towards this understanding that climate change is a problem now for us today and yesterday. There's a tendency, especially in the mainstream media, to sort of kick the can down the road. You'll often see the date 2100, for example, in mainstream reporting on climate breakdown. And conveniently, that's when all the worst problems will arise, when everybody alive today is dead, basically. And that's part of the denial and the propaganda that's baked into the discourse, the mainstream discourse about climate breakdown. So shifting the needle, or the Overton window, really, towards a more reality-based view of climate breakdown is part of Extinction Rebellion's goals. And I think the way that we do that is by reaching the people who are closest to that realization.
Beyond awareness, is there a specific public policy agenda that is part of the Extinction Rebellion effort?
Yes. There are 3 core demands, and we're working on expanding and establishing others and building out the details of these demands. But I can tell you that the first demand is basically what I was just saying. The first demand is that governments and corporations and the media speak honestly and truthfully about the empirical reality of climate breakdown. So this is important so that we can actually have an understanding of the situation and engage in appropriate and adequate responses to the situation. And this is something that we practice ourselves, familiarizing ourselves with the science and learning how to communicate most effectively about climate breakdown. Because quite frankly, if it were the case that we simply needed to list facts or statistics, then Al Gore, for example, would have saved the world 10 or 15 years ago when he released that documentary, right? It's more than just listing facts. It's more than just the science. So communicating about that is important. That's the first demand. The second demand goes more to your question, I think, which is a demand that fossil fuel, or rather carbon emissions, be reduced to net zero by 2025. And this is, it's extreme, but it's not that much more extreme than the Green New Deal, for example, that was proposed, I think, by Jill Stein during her Green Party campaign, and then picked up by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently. And so there are ways for us to do that, piggybacking off of those policy measures and expanding with some of our own. Then the third demand is a little more long-term and bigger picture oriented in terms of the reorganization of society, but I think it's absolutely crucial. And the third demand is the creation of a citizens' assembly, or a series of citizens' assemblies, from the local to the national or international. And these would be, direct, deliberative, democratic bodies composed of actual citizens with real concerns and real knowledge of their locality, coming together to make decisions about their own welfare. It's really a return to a simpler and more immediate form of politics, rather than a representative politics, which is so ingrained in American culture at this point, although in our origins there was much more direct democracy in America. But this is a return to those decision-making mechanisms, because in the face of the many and unpredictable challenges that are going to arise, we have to be agile in our response to those situations. For example, wildfires in California, we have to begin to assume that no one is going to help us. And I think the folks in Puerto Rico, for example, are well aware of that following the hurricane that they were hit with, or the folks who were struck by Katrina, and we can go on and on and on with different examples. The federal government of the United States is no longer reliable, if indeed it ever was, and that's actually leads me to mention just briefly another element of all of our demands, which is to pursue these demands with an eye towards justice, climate justice. So recognizing the historical reality that the consequences of climate breakdown and pollution and other related phenomena has fallen first and hardest on the most marginalized communities. So it's important to prioritize, for example, indigenous rights, Black rights, women's rights, etc., because in building a coalition that can resist and change these threats that we face, it's important to have solidarity on all of those fronts.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this direct action translating into political action specifically in the near future?
I hope so, but I'm not. I'm simultaneously pessimistic and optimistic. I'm a student of American history, and I understand the incentives in place for politicians to ignore, resist, or deny these demands. And we see this, unfortunately, even in the Democratic Party in the United States. They are clearly beholden to fossil fuel interests, despite some of their claims to the contrary. And I'm not sure that the internal inertia of basically the neoliberal establishment will allow for the kinds of swift and drastic policy measures that we need to be implemented to take place. And so that's also part of why the Citizens Assembly is so important for us to take collective action in pursuit of these policies on our own. But at the same time, we have seen some receptivity, and the popularity of the Green New Deal is growing. And so it is possible that we may see some policy measures put into place. But my expectation is that not only will the policies that we most need not be put into place, in fact, we will continue to see policies adopted that make the situation worse, because this system is basically running off of the momentum from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution itself. Our entire society is thoroughly captured by oil, basically, by fossil fuels. Between plastic and fuel consumption itself, it structures our entire global society, the industrialized world. So this transition will have to be creative, I think, and that will involve working outside of conventional channels, working with them where possible. But if those methods had worked, again, we would be in a very different place. We would have listened to James Hansen in the late 1980s, for example, when he gave his congressional testimony about the reality of climate breakdown, but we haven't.
In sort of an quick overview, what does that world look like? What does that post-industrial world look like to you?
Yeah, I think it would be a slower-paced world. I think it would be a simpler world, a more sustainable world. It's difficult to imagine. There's a famous line from Slavoj Žižek who says that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that's, I think, borne out by our obsession with apocalyptic and superhero movies, for example. We fantasize about the end of the world, but we can't imagine possible alternatives to the system of social organization that we currently live under. But through, my studies and many others within Extinction Rebellion, we are able to imagine possible alternatives. And I think I think it's important to emphasize first that it's not just going to be a winding back of the clock. We're not just going to go back to, say, the Middle Ages or medieval times, the pre-industrial times, because circumstances have changed drastically. For example, human population growth alone. Human population has increased from under 1 billion, just under 1 billion in the year 1800 to now over 7.5 billion. That's a massive and exponential increase in just about 200 years. So that mere fact alone makes it impossible for us to sort of just return to a simpler, maybe like agrarian lifestyle or something. So, but at the same time, I think the reality of climate breakdown demands that we return to something like a simpler and more immediate and more local way of life, recognizing that we will lose, or we ought to lose, the ability to catch a commercial flight across the country, for example. These kinds of things will necessarily need to go away, and that will completely change society. I think maybe one way of imagining this is to recognize that for many people, this different way of life is already here, or it's close to on its way. Consider Flint, Michigan, for example. This is a preview, I think, for where much of the rest of the world and the United States is heading. This is a community that, as Michael Moore shows convincingly in his recent documentary, Fahrenheit 11/9, has been under deliberate and sustained attack by its own government, literally being poisoned systematically and intentionally by the local and state governments of Michigan, combined with sort of the larger system-wide effects of climate breakdown. You have a community that has realized that it must band together for its own survival. And those new communities will be necessarily creative and rooted in the particulars of their localities. So I think that we can sort of expand that model to much of the rest of the world. We're going to have to become much more neighborly, I think.
And finally, Rory, talk a little bit about the action that took place in New York this past weekend.
Sure. The action had been planned basically since the beginning of the formation of the New York City chapter in early December. We've been working on this for some time, and it involved multiple, sort of a series of direct actions. We met first on Saturday afternoon about 1 o'clock in near the southeast corner of Central Park, gathered there, and the crowd formed probably 300 people, I think, at this point, a fairly large-sized crowd for a first day of action, especially with the possibility of arrest sort of up front in our plans. None of our actions were cleared with the police, even the gathering at the southeast corner of Central Park itself. So we gathered there, music, song, dancing, chants, etc., got the crowd organized and ready to go, and then a marching band began playing, and we took off walking down Fifth Avenue towards Rockefeller Center. This was unpermitted march. NYPD at this point are sort of swarming and flanking us as we go, not bothering us really, but just observing their numbers growing as we continued down the street. And as we arrived at Rockefeller Center, the group split into several subgroups and various actions took place. Die-ins occurred, so folks lied down on the sidewalk and around Rockefeller Center, drawing attention to, the issues. And a blockade of Fifth Avenue occurred for about 20 minutes. Members of Extinction Rebellion stopped traffic across Fifth Avenue. Eight of these folks were arrested and later released that evening. And then this sort of the centerpiece of the action occurred on the ice skating rink at Rockefeller Center itself. So many of the demonstrators surrounded the upper level of the rink, looking over the ledge, while others, about 20 others, went down on the ice and formed a die-in the shape of the Extinction Rebellion logo, which is sort of like a circle with an hourglass in the middle. And then one of our members, Greg Schwadock, climbed down using a harness onto the back of the Golden Prometheus statue, a very famous statue, looking over the ice rink there at Rockefeller Center. He climbed onto that statue and hung a massive banner reading "Climate Change Equals Mass Murder" and providing some details about Extinction Rebellion, including our website, etc. And this was a very stark visual and quickly drew the attention of media. We got coverage from all three local branches of the major networks, lots of newspaper coverage as well. And our hope was that this made people aware that Extinction Rebellion has arrived now in America. And the hope is that we will see the movements grow as we approach the April 15th International Rebellion Week, which we are now planning for.
Rory Varrato, the organization Extinction Rebellion, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.